Hello there, fellow cultists. This is DM Nell, and I'm back with another episode of Shadow Talk. And this one is episode number 116. And today we're tackling chapter 9, I believe. Yep, chapter 9, running the game. And of course, this is chapter 9 of the core rulebook for Shadow the Demon Lord. All right, so this chapter's got a lot in it. It actually has 10 categories. I believe it's 10. So I'm not going to cover this in as much detail as I've covered previous chapters because a lot of it has to do with very basic GMing, you know, recommendations. And my belief is that if you're coming to Shadow the Demon Lord, you're probably coming to this game having experienced in other role-playing games such as Dungeons and Dragons, and so you probably already have some experience running games. But this is an excellent chapter for game masters, and so there's a lot of good information in here. I do recommend reading it in its entirety. I'm just not going to cover it in the granularity that I've covered other chapters in. Okay, so let's just jump right in here and see what this chapter has to offer. So it talks about the game master's job of being a narrator, a referee, and an advocate for the player characters, teaching the rules, and also building the world. So again, these are all things that you probably already know as a game master, or have taken part in with other game systems. There's no difference for these concepts in Shadow of the Demon Lord than in any other game system. So moving on past that, then you've got the game mastery benefits. Concepts like story trumps rules, which basically, again, pretty much means that you and your players are collaboratively engaged in building a story when you're playing a role-playing game. Now, to the degree that you guys want to do this, varies from table to table, but you should never let the rules get in the way of making a cool story. I usually say that with the caveat that you have to have a baseline of rules. You have to have rules in order for stories to work. Otherwise, you get plot gaps, and you don't want to say on the one hand that magic works a certain way, but then just hand wave it later on, because that creates an incongruity in the story that leaves a bad taste in somebody's mouth, and that'd be my mouth, because I need my story and my game rules to complement each other, not contradict each other. So story trumps rules, yes, but don't go crazy with it. Keep it short and sweet. I agree with that. Your players will their eyes will glaze over if you go into a monologue that lasts an hour and a half. Get to the point, give them the basics. If you're talking more than your players are talking, then you're probably doing it wrong, and I'm guilty of this. So it's something you constantly have to monitor. So you definitely want to lay the groundwork for the characters, but keep it short and sweet. Give them the information they need to make good decisions, or bad decisions, as the case may be. Use the player's imagination. So this is Game Master Gold here. If you do as the previous thing said and keep it short and sweet, you're basically giving them enough information to allow their imaginations to start concocting different scenarios. A lot of the times players will verbalize this and will give you ideas as a game master on things you didn't even think of. So this is something that you can use to enhance your game. Take the game in a direction that you didn't think of, but is actually cooler than what you had come up with. And just basically let your player characters help drive the campaign forward. That also applies to making sure that you're listening to them when they're doing their character creation, what their characters' motivations are, and incorporating those things into the story. Those also can drive where the game goes. All right, improvise. So when things don't go as planned, then you have to be able to improvise in order to keep the game going. This is just basic GMing skill that any game master needs in order to be able to, on the fly, take the game in a different direction that they had not anticipated. And this happens all the time. I mean, this is not something that you can prepare for generally. What you as a game master will normally do is, try to plot out a course that is the most likely given the things that you're putting on the table in front of the characters. But there's generally anywhere from 2 to 8 players against 1 GM. So 2 to 8 imaginations versus 1 imagination. There's a good chance that those 8 minds are going to come up with something that you did not anticipate. So you gotta be able to, turn your game on the dime, and go with the flow and take it in a different direction. There are ways of doing that, and there are videos out there that give you suggestions and tools on how to improvise. One guy I listened to, Sly Flourish, who's also known as, his real name is Mike Shea. He's the Lazy DM. He's got lots of monikers. But anyway, he puts out a series of videos all directed towards game masters and how to improve their game. And improvisation is one of the topics he refers to frequently and gives lots of suggestions on. So I definitely suggest checking out his videos if you haven't already. Steal liberally. I don't know a game master that doesn't do this already, but don't rely solely on your own imagination. I mean, you can, but that's a lot of burden to put on your game master. Instead, take inspiration from wherever you can. Comic books, movies, TV shows, local news, whatever gets you inspiration to create the framework for a story. Steal it liberally. All right, deciding what happens here. Let's see. All that really saying is that you need to be the arbiter of your game. So if there is a decision point that needs to be made, whether something succeeds, fails, or partially succeeds or partially fails, and you're the one that has to make that determination. So don't shy away from that responsibility. You need it in order to keep the game going. And you also need to be consistent with that. So if you make a ruling in this game session, write it down at the end of the game so that you can reference what you decided on that particular rule in future games in the event that comes up again. Using common sense, again, this is a no-brainer. Make sure that your player characters are still functioning under the rules of physics. Yes, it's a fantasy game. Yes, it's got magic, but gravity still works unless you say it doesn't work. There are still consequences for bad actions. So, those things need to apply in order for the game to have any sense of realism to immerse your players into the game world. Now, again, it's a fantasy world, so there's going to be fantastic elements in your game, but it's got to be grounded in what the players know, and they know the real world physics. So make sure that those things apply, until you use some characteristic of the fantasy world to make them not apply. All right, attributes and characteristics. Again, once again, goes through each characteristic and talks about you know what sort of things does strength apply to, what sort of things does agility apply to, and so on. Boons and Banes, it goes into a little bit more detail on Boons and Banes, but Boons and Banes are pretty simple once you understand the concept. This is basically just saying how you should apply Boons and Banes, and really it's just saying apply them liberally. If you think a character would have a benefit from being, a couple feet off the ground when attacking another creature, give them a boon for it. Or conversely, a creature's got the higher ground on the character. Give the character a bane for trying to attack the creature. It worked in Star Wars, right? So don't be afraid to apply boons and banes. Boons and banes are there for you to pile on based on whatever situations are benefiting the player characters or working against them. Automatic success, don't make everything a dice roll. Things work automatically. If your character is going to open a door, don't make them roll for it. Just let them open the door. If the character was a farmer and they're in the field trying to identify a crop, they should be able to identify a crop without you making them, make an intellect challenge roll. So, just let them do it and save the rolls for things that really matter. Okay, so let's see. Talked about boons and banes up here, and it talks about boons and banes down here. So, anyway. Let's see. Affecting another creature, profession. So, this section goes into how you use the professions in the game. And, it's kind of talked about in the previous section that we already covered, previous chapter. But this goes and gives you some examples on how you can use a character's profession in the game to allow them to, as a skill substitute. So other game systems have skills: stealth, knowledge, survival. These are all specific skills, at least in D&D, that you're either proficient in or you're not proficient in, and that determines how. What chances you have to apply that skill to a given situation. But in Shadow of the Demon Lord, you don't have specific skills. Instead, you have professions. And this section here just talks about how you can use those professions to apply to those scenarios where a player character may know how something works or may have the skill to bypass a particular challenge. So this is a good section to read through. All right, so let's see. It talks about setbacks and opportunities, player-driven setback and opportunities, describing outcomes, damage and healing. So this is a nice little chart. If you're so baseline damage. So this table sets out expected damage for effects based on the group's level, both for damage dealt and damage healed. Refer to the unlimited column for an ongoing effect, such as catching on fire or immersion in a pool of acid. Use the limited column for a one-time effect, such as a cave-in, explosion, or applying a healing poultice. So this is a really nice chart. So at the starting tier, if your characters are caught in a cave-in, how much damage do you apply to that? Well, as a GM, you might just say, pull it out of your ass and say, 2d6 damage or whatnot. But that might be a bit much for starting tier characters. So this table helps to set parameters on how much damage or healing should be applied based on the group level. So in this case, a cave-in is recommended to deal a d6 plus 2 damage. That gives the characters a fighting chance to survive a cave-in. So this is a nice little table. Bookmark this page. Time and pacing. How to pace your game is always a good GM skill to have. And then it talks about, just going from the general flow of the game to now we're in a round. So how to transition from just the normal storytelling time frame into keeping track of things round by round. Okay, styles of horror. So this is a good section for this game in particular because this is a fantasy horror game, and the horror part is always difficult to capture. Horror is a really hard thing to do right in a role-playing game. Sometimes it comes off as silly, sometimes it comes off as goofy, sometimes it comes off as too gory, and you overly rely on gore, and you really don't inspire fear or instill a sense of shock or terror in your players, which is really the goal for horror games. You really want to set up things so that it seems scary. A lot of people try to rely on game mechanics like the frightened condition, or in Shadow of the Demon Lord you have these traits, frightening and horrifying, and those are just numbers. Numbers don't scare people generally. What scares people are things that are, good descriptions, good foreshadowing, things like that. So this section of this chapter gives really good advice on how to set things up if you want to shock your player characters, instill a sense of terror or revulsion, or if you have scenarios where you have hauntings and you want to really set up the tone of a haunting, running apparitions, stuff like that. So this is a really good section of the chapter, and I recommend that you read through it thoroughly. Of course, you have the obligatory sidebar here that is essentially a trigger warning for GMs that some things might be a little bit too much for some player characters to take. So you want to be sure that you let your player characters know that your game is going to have some stuff that might make them uncomfortable, and give them an out if it is something that they don't want to mix with their role-playing experience. Okay, so next we have running adventures. This section of the chapter talks about or gives you ideas on how to get your adventures going, how to hook your players, and foreshadowing and stuff like that. So again, if you're an experienced GM, you pretty much know how to do these things already, but again, it gives good information here, so it's good refresher, even if you have been running games forever like I have. Now, it also provides you some advice, such as the 3 don'ts. Don't tell the player characters what their characters do, think, or feel. Don't forget that player characters are the protagonists, so make them the heroes, not your NPCs. And don't tell the players more than they need to know. Creating adventures, creating objectives. And it gives a list of bullet points here on some objectives that you could have for your games that are specific to Shadow of the Demon Lord. Have a starting point. Scene creation. Obstacle scenes, scene setting, scene structure, have a beginning, middle, and an end. Recommended difficulty per day. So if you're a starting tier group, you want to limit your difficulties to 25, novice to 100, expert to 200, and master to 500. And that's per day. So if you have 3 encounters, you want to be sure that those add up to less than 100 if you're a novice tier group. All right, so anyway, again, that's just basic information on how to set up and run adventures. The next section here is a conclusion, how to end an adventure. how to structure your plot so that it makes sense. And there's a lot of interesting information here. Different types of plots like the gauntlet, the well, the web. And this goes into a whole lot of, story structure theory and game structure theory. This might be useful for a new DM, but for me, I just kind of shoot from the hip and go with what feels right based off of trial and error. Of course, that relies on experience, so that doesn't help new GMs. But, for me, I don't really have a whole lot of need for this type of information in a chapter like this. But again, for new GMs, it's worthwhile read. So if you're new to GMing in general and you're coming to Shadow of the Demon Lord, definitely read through that section. All right, adventures by level. So breaks it down by the different levels and tiers on how adventures should be created and run. Then we have campaigns, and it talks about campaigns. So again, you should know what a campaign is if you're a dungeon master with any experience whatsoever. But essentially, a campaign is stringing together adventures into an overarching narrative that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it can be tough to have a campaign that makes sense. I actually had a campaign about a year or so back that I ran that I had plotted out from start to end. I had just an idea and an outline for how I wanted the campaign to run. But when I finished the expert tier, I'd gotten to a point in the campaign where I really didn't feel like what I'd come up with for the master tier was satisfying. And my expert tier actually brought the campaign to a satisfying end. So I decided to end it at the expert tier rather than tacking on the additional stuff that I had come up with for the master tier that really didn't add any value to the story. So campaign development is an art form in and of itself, and this again gives you some guidance on how to do that. All right, so then we get into exploration and travel. This is a really important section of this chapter because exploration and travel happens frequently in your games, and you need to be able to understand how things like terrain and movement affect your game sometimes. Now, sometimes you just want to hand wave it. If you want to say you traveled from Lidge to crossings in the Northern Reach, you can easily say your player characters spend a couple of months traveling overland. You take a boat for part of the travel. You go through through some mountain passes, and a couple months later you land up in Lidge. That's perfectly acceptable to hand wave travel like that. However, other games and other GMs like to play those things out. So when you do that, you need some guidance, and this chapter, or this section of this chapter, provides that type of information. So it starts with perception and gives you some guidance on how to use perception for travel. It gives you the section on travel, which gives you these two tables, terrain and movement, which tells you the time multiplier for the different terrains that your group is moving through. So, it's more difficult to travel through the desert, forest, and hills than it is through, just open plain. And it's definitely more difficult to travel through mountains, and swamps can also be, troublesome. So, it gives you the recommended modifiers here on how much time it should take to travel through these different types of terrains. Weather is something that I tend to forget frequently to incorporate into a game, and it is a valuable way of immersing your players into your game world. If you forget the weather, then that's a key aspect of the real world that affects a lot of things. If you are planning on attending a ball game and a thunderstorm rolls through, then that's going to ruin your day. The same thing applies to weather in your games. If your player characters are traveling over land and a thunderstorm rolls through, that's really going to ruin their day. And if it's unseasonably cold and they're not wearing cold weather gear because they didn't expect the cold weather, that will ruin their day. If it's unseasonably hot and they have to strip down to avoid overheating, that can cause problems if they all of a sudden have an encounter on the road and they're not wearing their armor. So these are things that should be incorporated into your game to, again, get that immersion in there and get that sense of realism that the game world is a real place that their characters are adventuring in, and that has real world scenarios and real world impacts. All right, so let's see, what else do we have here? Talks about getting lost. I personally don't like the whole getting lost thing. It tends to drag on and really not fun for anybody. It's good for a short portion of your game, but don't let it last too long because it can get old really fast. Encounter frequency and encounters. So I actually have a whole video where I talk about this. I forget what number it is, but it's in my back catalog. So if you're interested, check it out. But this is a really good guide on, if you want to have random encounters, or if you want to plan out how many encounters that your group is going to have in a given session, then these two tables here are really useful for that purpose. So be sure that you spend a little bit of time reading through that. That goes into the combat difficulty here. The encounter difficulty table, again, is something that I touched on in that video that I just mentioned. Battlefield. So a battlefield is everywhere combat takes place. It can be inside a desecrated temple, on the slopes of Mount Fear. So in practical terms, you are either playing in a dungeon, or you're playing in some outdoor area, or you're playing in some cityscape or something like that. But you want to be sure that, again, you immerse your player characters into that environment. So if there's a building, there should be things that can be climbed or hidden behind, or there should be alleys. If you are in a forest, there should be trees that can be climbed. There should be, heavy brush that they have to chop through. If you're in a swamp, there should be areas that they have to trudge through with, monsters lurking just below the surface unseen. These are things that need to be incorporated into the battlefield, and they should have effects. If you're waist high in water in a swamp, then your movement's going to be impacted. You're not going to be moving as fast as you would across an open field. So make sure these things are incorporated into your game to, get that sense of realism. Make them feel like they're in a swamp. Make them feel like they're in a city. Excuse me, a city. Make them feel like they're on a mountaintop. And, a wrong step in any direction could lead to them falling off a 1,000-foot cliff. Let me see what else we have here. It talks about using miniatures and maps. And, it talks a little starting position. So, if you're using Theater of the Mind, be sure to, make your descriptions specific enough so that the characters can associate where they're at versus where everything else is in the Theater of the Mind scenario that you're building. I'm not a big fan of Theater of the Mind. I need visual context to my encounters, so I tend to use miniatures and maps. But I know a lot of people like the Theater of the Mind style of play. It's easy, it's cheap, but it also has its complexities. And what I found is that not every player is comfortable with theater of the mind. There are a lot of people that have difficulty visualizing. There are a lot of people that have difficulty listening to a description and coming up with the same mind map that the GM is trying to relay. And a lot of people forget a description or just miss it altogether. A description that the GM is laying out that could have, implications in the scenario, or ramifications in the scenario. So theater of the mind is really challenging. I tend to keep theater of the mind scenarios for really basic, simple things. You're in a hallway. There's a monster in front of you. There's no way around it. It's you and the monster. There's not a whole lot to describe there. It's very easy to visualize something like that. But once you are in an open cavern where there's lava flows over here, and there's a chasm over here, and there's stalagmites and stalactites all over the place, and you've got a faction of drow over here and a faction of well, there's no drow in this game, but a faction of troglodytes over here, and then you have a dragon over there, and then you've got some creature lurking on the ceiling. That's way too much to keep in your mind map throughout that whole scenario. So I would, for complicated encounters, where you have two or more monsters that are on play, or you have a very dynamic battlefield, I would definitely use some sort of visual aid to allow the player characters to know where all the key elements of the battlefield are located in relation to where they're at and how they can interact with these things. All right, so there's a good little optional rule for surrounding, which allows characters that outnumber an opponent to get a boon. This is very similar to flanking in D&D. It's an optional rule, so it's not something that you need to use. I have used it. It doesn't break the game, and it gives a nice little tactical element to incorporate. All right, area effects. It gives some guidance on how to do area effects if you're not using a grid. Excuse me, I have hiccups. If you're not using a grid, if you got a square grid or a hex grid, there's some guidelines on how to do area effects. Rounds, turns, and actions gives you information on how to adjudicate those. Improvised activities. You want to encourage your player characters to use the environment around them and come up with cool things that they can do. Like the example is always swinging from a chandelier. Like that's the coolest thing a character can do for some reason. And I really haven't seen that a whole lot in, maybe in older movies like Robin Hood or stuff like that from the 50s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. But at any rate, that's always the example that's given, swinging from a chandelier. So, if you get your jollies off of swinging from a chandelier or stuff like that, then, let your player characters experience that and give them a rush for coming up with some innovative way of using the environment. And use your boons and banes liberally to allow them or to hamper them on these types of activities. Improvised attacks, Professor Dungeon Master, which is another video series I like to watch. He likes to say that every character has the right to murder somebody with a leg of mutton. So, if you're in a tavern and you're eating a leg of mutton and a fight breaks out, then your player character should be able to grab that leg of mutton and smash people over the head with it. All right. There are things that can cause extra damage. So, if you are fighting near a lava flow and somebody catches fire, then, they should catch fire and take damage for that. Attacking multiple targets, imposing afflictions, good information for GMs on how to do that sort of stuff. What else? Ending the combat. So don't be afraid to let your monsters or your opponents flee or surrender. Not everybody fights to the death. All right, the next section is focused on player characters. So here we talk about character creation, how starting levels should feel. What about character death? And character death is a real thing in Shadow of the Demon Lord, at least at low levels. It's mitigated pretty well at the mid to upper tiers of the game, just like in most role-playing games. But death can be real at the starting and novice tiers, so you definitely want to pay attention to that. Character exits. If you have players that are leaving the game and you want their character to to exit in a logical manner from your story, then this section here, it gives you some guidance on how to do that. Also for introducing new characters. Secondary characters. Some GMs like players to have secondary characters, so here's how to keep those going. Ways to come up with characters on the fly, physical traits, motivations, personality traits. So that's also useful for NPCs. Let's see here. Major characters play a significant part in the story. They might be villains and their subordinates, temporary companions, patrons, employers, contacts the player characters rely on, and so forth. So this is a way to easily come up with those things on the fly. You could actually create these things in advance also and just keep a list and pull that list out when you need to. All right, minor characters, background characters, role-playing secondary characters. Okay, so now we get into the section that I really enjoy in this chapter, which is the Shadow of the Demon Lord, the name of the game itself. So what is exactly the Shadow of the Demon Lord? Well, it can be a actual physical thing, or it can be a metaphysical thing. It's up to you as a GM, but it should, regardless of whether it is an actual or metaphysical thing, it should have real world impacts, real world in-game impacts. Using the shadow helps you to create a campaign that has a theme. And remember, this game is intended to be the apocalypse of your game world. So when you are establishing your campaign, it should be with the intention that the world is, in danger of ending as a result of this thing that is happening to your world. Now, this thing can be one campaign or it can be multiple campaigns where there are a series of things that are happening that build on each other to lead to an apocalypse. Or you could say every campaign leads to the apocalypse. And your player characters either ride the wave to the end of the world or they find a way to stop the apocalypse. Either way is a fun way to run your game. Using the Shadow of the Demon Lord allows you to set up that framework. And there are 20 different shadows that are listed in the core rulebook, and these are expanded upon in the Hunger in the Void supplement. But it gives you the basic information in the core rulebook here. So these go from the Black Sun all the way to Winter's Grasp. So I'm not going to read through each of these. I'm going to touch on each of them, but I'm not going to read through each of them. Just kind of give you my my quick and dirty summary of what each of these are. So the Black Sun is probably my favorite. I've not used it yet. I'm kind of building towards that in my campaign. So just to give you an example, my personal Shadow of the Demon Lord campaign is what I refer to as a mega campaign. So I started my Shadow of the Demon Lord campaign with Tales of the Demon Lord, which is a full adventure path. So that was my first campaign for my home group. That did not end the world. So I had a second campaign. That did not end the world. So I had a third campaign. Each of these campaigns has a separate Shadow of the Demon Lord that provides the framework for the adventures in that campaign, or the theme for all the adventures in that campaign. And it also provides a potential end of the world scenario if the player characters, aren't taking the game seriously and they just fuck around and find out, right? So that means that each of these campaigns should have meaning, should be, if your group doesn't do something, the world is going to end. So that's how I run my campaign. However, you could very easily say Shadow of the Demon, or the Tales of the Demon Lord, ends the world at the end of that game. The Black Sun ends the world in that particular campaign that you're running. Either way to go is perfectly fine. It's totally up to you as a GM and how you want to progress or present the apocalypse in your campaign. If you're only planning on running one Shadow of the Demon Lord campaign before you go on to another game system, then yeah, make it an epic end of world from start to finish, using one of these Shadow of the Demon Lord scenarios to provide you that framework for how your world is going to end in your one Shadow of the Demon Lord campaign. The Black Sun is a cool one because basically what happens with the Black Sun is that there is something that blots out the sun and causes the sun to turn black, essentially. That does not have the effect that you might think it would have. It actually, you would think with the sun being blotted out that the world would start to freeze, but it in fact has a opposite effect. The world heat becomes becomes like a hellish furnace, destroying life as the landscape becomes a bone-strewn dust bowl. So the Black Sun, I liken it to what a campaign, like bringing the Dark Sun campaign from D&D into Shadow of the Demon Lord system. I would use the Black Sun as that campaign model, as the framework. Just being outside during the daytime is danger in and of itself. The sun is a danger in and of itself. So that is something that you would progress. So, the Black Sun starts at the starting tier and it gets worse as the game progresses. The effects of going outside become worse. And, things like that just are described here in the game effect. So this is one of my favorites. The Black Sun is very evocative. Again, it brings the imagery of the Dark Sun campaign setting to my mind instantly. Also, it reminds me very much of the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. I believe the second Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. That book series, if you guys are familiar with, let's see, what's his name? Donaldson. The author's name is Donaldson, although I forget his first name. Anyway, it's a good series. It's a good fantasy series. Very similar situation where the sun is actually a threat. Okay, so then we have another Shadow of the Demon Lord, which is Bloom. So the Shadow of the Demon Lord falls upon the world and causes the flora to become infused with malevolent power, which results in plants shooting up to astonishing sizes. Forests spring up overnight. Vines swallow cities. Overland travel becomes almost impossible. So it affects the environment. Viruses could go insane. This could be like the Jody Verrill Creepshow episode where that alien contagion basically causes people to turn into plants. So yeah, this is this is an interesting nature takes over type of effect. So if you're really wanting to play out your social justice fantasy, use Bloom, boy, because you got nature as your antagonist, and payback is hell, right? All right, so what's next? A corrupted organization is the default shadow for the setting. It's assumed that, or no, I'm sorry. I'm jumping ahead of myself. Corrupted organization is not the default setting. Corrupted organization basically takes an organization such as the Inquisition or the Black Hand, and they gain a lot of power, and it is doing they are doing things like rituals, summoning demons and things like that. That's weakening the fabric of the barrier that separates the world and this universe from the void. And so the corrupted organization is what's causing the downfall of and the apocalypse to actually happen. Not one of my favorites. Curse of the Beastmen. So overnight, 1 person in 10 transforms into a Beastman. So all of a sudden you have millions of new Beastmen appear, and they're all subservient to the Demon Lord. So that's going to cause problems. Demonic incursion. So all of a sudden demons start popping into the world. Void apertures begin opening here and there. Lots of different effects that come with that, as outlined in the man, I cannot think this morning, and I already talked about it once, the Hunger in the Void supplement. So demonic incursion is a great end of world scenario where demons becoming more and more prevalent as the shadow progresses and the campaign progresses. The Dragon Awakens. This is classic. There is a whole movie that you can base this on, which is what's it called? It's got Christian Bale and Gerard Butler, and it is Fire, not the Fire Down Below, Fire. Something about fire. But anyway, there's a movie basically that is this scenario. The Dragon Awakens is the great dragon awakens, and all other dragons basically start to attack the world under the direction of the great dragon, and it's a dragon apocalypse. Which who doesn't want to play out a dragon apocalypse? I actually want to do this. I don't know how I'm going to incorporate it into my mega campaign, but I definitely want to do this because I have hundreds of dragon miniatures just laying around this basement. I've got a whole bucket over here full of dragons. I've got dragons all along my shelf. I've got Big Red over here. I've got Tiamat over here. I've got an undead dragon over there. I've got so many dragons that have never seen my tabletop, just because dragons are cool, but you don't have a dragon in every scenario that you run. So I cannot possibly play every dragon that I own in a campaign unless I have this Dragon Awakens scenario going, in which case I can bring out all the dragons. All the dragons are going to be on the table at some point. So beware, my players. There will be a dragon apocalypse in your future. All right, Dreams of the Dead God. I ran this one, and it's a fun one because you can really have scenarios, really wonky scenarios where reality is warping, and just crazy shit's going on all around. Things like this where the world just breaking apart and floating. A lot like Thanos' world, where the laws of reality and physics are breaking down, and just wonky things are turning the landscape into a Salvador Dali painting. It's a really fun shadow to run a game through. Fall of Civilization is the default setting for the Shadow of the Demon Lord, because it is if you're using the core setting that I described in the last video, you are starting the Fall of Civilization with the Fall of the Empire. And so how that plays out throughout your campaign, that in and of itself could result in the end of the world. Not through any cosmic cataclysm, but basically through the orcs destroying all civilization and enslaving everybody, and causing 1,000 years of darkness under the tyrannical rule of the Drudge, the orc king. Then you have famine and drought. So the rain stops, weeks turn into months, and months turn into years without a drop from the sky. Water becomes more precious than gold, and the ultimate power belongs to those mortals who can reliably create water with magic. So this can be this can actually complement the Black Sun scenario that I talked about earlier, or it can be its own thing. It can be you can set up a road warrior type situation with this. But there's plenty of movies and things where famine and drought are featured that you can steal ideas from. The Herald of the Demon Lord. So this I envision mostly as the Silver Surfer arrives in the form of some kind of demon, and it is the foreshadowing of the Demon Lord, who is Galactus, that's coming to destroy the world. So this demon prince manifests in the world, and demon princes are bad dudes. So again, Hunger in the Void talks about demon princes. When they arrive, something cataclysmic happens in a big area. And so that's the Herald of the Demon Lord. Not a nice Silver Surfer, but a badass, mean Silver Surfer that is truly a servant of the Demon Lord. And with that arrival of the Demon Prince, all hell starts to break loose. So there are different demon princes. You can come up with your own, but there are three that are outlined in Hunger in the Void. One is the Destroyer of Worlds. One is the Lord of Undeath, and the other is I think a disease-ridden one. So the Herald of the Demon Lord is very evocative. It starts your campaign off with a bang. So it starts your campaign off with this Demon Lord or this Demon Prince arriving. And so, boom, you've already got the shadow established. The Demon Prince has arrived. It's rampaging through the world, and everything around it is just going to hell. Infectious madness. So insanity is spreading through civilization for reasons unknown. And this is a great way to run that type of campaign if you're interested. I'm not interested. I would actually incorporate this into another shadow effect and just kind of combine the two. In and of itself, this is not, to me, an end of world scenario, unless you want to use it like 28 Days Later, where you have the rage zombies. So you could have the infectious madness be manifested in rage zombies. That's one way to go with it, I guess. Then you have the infestation shadow. So kind of like Bloom, except it affects vermin. So this means that vermin such as rats, locusts, hornets, roaches, maggots, they exponentially grow and become a threat to the world, devouring it in swarms. And I kind of like this one from a if you take the if you have a big bad guy that is like the manifestation of all of these swarms into this gigantic sentient vermin colony. That's how I kind of envision that shadow ending. That's like the big bad guy at the end of the book, kind of like Caius. If you recall, if you're old and busted like me, and you recall the Age of Worms campaign path, the adventure path that Paizo had in the Dragon Magazine series way back when, that would be kind of like a good way to run an infestation. Now the Age of Worms was more of a undead apocalypse, but I would use that Caius figure to be the big bad for this infestation shadow. Then you have invaders. Invaders would be just that, invaders from somewhere else. So that could be invaders from the ocean. So maybe you have like an Atlantis type civilization. that's invading the surface world. Maybe you have aliens. Maybe the civilization that is on the moon, Tartarus, decides to come down and invade the world. Or perhaps you have an alien species like the Reen that decide that they're going to invade Earth. Lots of ways to do this shadow, and again, lots of movies that feature invasions that you can copy that from. All right, Looming Star is another one that I have used. So you got a star that appears in the night sky and is approaching the world rapidly. And the radiance from this star causes people on Earth to mutate. So here's a mutation table. So this is a mutant apocalypse essentially. So this would be another way to go. Pandemic. Oh man, I'm not even going to touch that one. I think we all know how a pandemic shadow can play out. Restless Dead. So this is an undead or a zombie apocalypse. So lots of examples on how to run a zombie apocalypse in pop culture. Unruly Earth. So again, this is another nature rebels scenario, except rather than the wildlife, it's the actual Earth itself that begins to cause upheavals. So 2012 would be a good movie to base this this shadow on. Then you have Weird Magic. So magic itself becomes unreliable, unstable, and whenever you use it, bad things can happen. Not really a apocalypse scenario that I can see. This would kind of work well with another shadow effect, I think. But you could build it towards, just casting one spell could rip open a hole in the void, causing an influx of demons to come in. So yeah, I mean, you could use it that way. The Wild Hunt. So those of you that like stories involving the Fae, here you go. The Wild Hunt is unleashed upon the world. The fairies come out of their hidden kingdoms and try to eradicate humanity from the face of the earth. And then finally, Winter's Grasp. So Winter's Grasp is the apocalypse by Ice Age. And so an ice age falls upon the world and everything crawls to a halt. Ice monsters start taking over, and so that one seems a little bit boring to me, but it's there if you want to use that. All right, so again, that's probably my favorite portion of this chapter. The different shadow events are great ways of providing a framework for your campaign. Game Master's Toolbox. So this section talks about the various game mechanics within the game and how to use them effectively, such as corruption, deprivation. So if your characters are not getting a proper rest or they're not eating properly, that should have ramifications, and this talks about how that would be applied. Disease. Disease is one of those things in the game that I think is underutilized in most role-playing games. Diseases should be scary, but there's too many easy ways to overcome disease, this game included. So it's difficult for disease to really take hold and become a scary thing unless it becomes something that spreads rapidly and affects large swaths of the population. But anyway, it talks about how to adjudicate and incorporate disease into your game. Exposure, being out in extreme heat or extreme cold should have effects on your characters. How to use fire in your game, how to use insanity in your game. One way to get rid of insanity or to mitigate insanity is by incorporating quirks. I'm not really a fan of that. I really, if you're going to have an insanity mechanic, it should be difficult to get rid of it. Insanity is not something you should be able to cure with a spell, in my opinion. or just by taking a quirk. Yeah, but your mileage may vary. Your game, if you don't want to focus on insanity, but you want to keep insanity in your game, then yeah, add your quirks. That helps to mitigate it, insanity and still have some effect. My experience has been that quirks are going to be forgotten. At first, they're going to be funny, but then unless your player is really good at role playing these things, eventually it's going to be forgotten and overlooked. Suffocation. So if you're drowning or if you are running out of air for whatever reason, those are rules for that. And then we get into traps. Traps are a good section in any Dungeon Master's Guide to have, because traps should be part of any fantasy role-playing game. And here you have your usual suspects: your dart trap, poison needle, and so on and so forth. So that's all described here. I'm not going to go through that. Then we talk about rewards. So you can have, you have the level increase. Level increase should be at the group level, not the individual level. You can have the option to require training before the group levels up. So there's a couple of paragraphs on that. Talks about treasure and how you should limit treasure by tier. Avoiding treasure talks about coins, gems, jewelry, other valuables, incorporating special items. Having connections in the game, so companions, contacts, informants, hirelings, things like that. A little sidebar and treasure maps and how that's a great treasure to hand out. And then we get to enchanted objects. So this game is a fantasy game, so you might expect fantasy games to have magic items. Well, it does, in the form of enchanted objects. However, this is not Dungeons and Dragons. You're not going to run into a third level dungeon and find +1 sword, gauntlets of ogre power, and ring of protection. That's not the way it works in Shadow of the Demon Lord. Every magic item is custom made. There is no assembly line method of creating magic items in this game. So if you find a ring, that is the only ring that has its qualities that exist in the world. Now, it could be a minor magic ring or it could be a powerful magic ring, but that particular magic ring is unique. And this section gives you ways of creating enchanted objects so that you can hand those out. And for those groups like mine that really enjoy having loot in every adventure that they can use to enhance their character, then you can definitely incorporate that using enchanted objects. However, the tables that are in here allow you to do it randomly if you want to do it, to come up with these randomly, or you can, create magic items using these tables as well. I have done both. And, again, this section of this chapter, very useful for magic item creation. So definitely keep that bookmarked. Then we have relics. So relics are the equivalent to artifacts from Dungeons and Dragons. Relics were created by powerful creatures for specific reasons or for a specific purpose, and should be those rare things that you might find once in a campaign. So the sample relics that we have here are the Book of Whispers, Circlet of Eyes, and the Floating Skull of Ugrash, or the Sword of Unmaking. I featured the Sword of Unmaking in one of my campaigns. I had the Floating Skull of Ugrash in my last campaign, but nothing really came of that. But the Sword of Unmaking is one of my favorites, and it's actually going to feature prominently in my final mega campaign ending campaign. But I've already incorporated it into Tales of the Demon Lord and my very first campaign, so it's going to be featured again in my very last campaign. All right, so those are the artifacts that are available here. And that's it. That finishes that running the game section chapter. That chapter is packed full of goodies, and I cannot emphasize enough that it is well worth your time to read through that chapter and bookmark a lot of the things in it, as you will be using them frequently in your campaigns. All right, so you see what's coming up next. I'm going to drop it here for today. And thank you once again for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that bell icon if you want to be notified when I drop a new video. And having said that, I'm getting the hell out of here and going to enjoy my real life. So, hail the Demon Lord, and I'm out. If I can figure out how to stop this damn thing.